Okay, so our final unit in this section of the course about groups is defective decision making. And this follows our discussion of conflict because often when groups are in conflict or having conflict, they don't make the best decisions and fall victim to some of the problems that come when groups can't seem to make good decisions. So this follows the study guide that I passed out today, and you'll want to take notes there. Okay, so unfortunately, all groups struggle to make decisions. Sometimes the groups will say that they're problem solving, but there's actually a slight difference between problem solving and decision making. Decision making is something that groups always have to do. They have to make small and big decisions, but the decisions might not necessarily need problems that need to be solved, right? Like you deciding what service project your group wants to do is a decision making decision. But as you work through schedules and try and solve work conflicts, that's problem solving. So kind of seeing the subtle differences between a problem solving discussion and a decision making discussion is that the decision making has an outcome. It has something that requires action at the end. And all groups need to do that. And that's often where errors occur, is when making these decisions. There are three really common problems that groups fall into when making decisions, and they're called confirmation bias, false dichotomy, and collective inferential error. And these are three outcomes or sort of like just methods that groups may fall victim to when they're making defective decisions. First is called the confirmation bias, and confirmation bias is when a group seeks out information that confirms only what they believe and their attitudes and ignores information that contradicts their beliefs and attitudes. So just as the title suggests, they're confirming a bias that they have. So they're only looking for information that will support a bias that they have instead of trying to figure out other alternatives or other ideas that maybe contradict the bias they might have. So groups that resist or try and resist confirmation bias, they have to actively search for flaws in their decisions and try and make better decisions and choices than groups that don't actively look for other decisions and choices. One really important term with confirmation bias is called rationalization of disconfirmation. And this is where you'll hear group members justify a decision with really ridiculous support. And they'll use examples that don't make a lot of sense, but they're trying to justify or rationalize why they're not looking to outside sources. And we'll talk more about that in a real way later. I'll give you an example in history of some confirmation bias. But this ultimately means that the group is really just sticking to one idea and only finding information that supports that idea or decision and not looking elsewhere and justifying their decision with sometimes really ridiculous means. I've seen this happen a lot with schools when like leadership in schools will make decisions about dances or dress codes and they don't really actively look at all sides of the issue. They just only get information that confirms their belief about the dress code or their belief about who should attend dances or who should have parking passes, right? And sometimes they'll come up with really ridiculous examples to support their decision that the rest of the outsiders are like, that doesn't even make sense, right? But that's what they're doing, is they're falling victim to confirmation bias. They're only looking for information that supports that behavior. So how do you resist in a group the confirmation bias? You have to have someone who is actively looking at the other side or looking at other options and make sure that it's presented in a group to the group in a way that's fair, so that when you hear an alternative or you hear a different solution, that it's presented in the same fairness as the solution that everybody seems to favor. Make sure you have a devil's advocate. This is a task role. It's somebody who's trying to contradict, not in an aggressive way, but in a helpful way, trying to contradict the group and trying to, make sure that they're thinking of all angles of the decision and make sure that it's not just one person trying to be the one that's bringing in the outside information. That person needs allies so that they don't feel like they're alone. The second problem with decisions that groups fall victim to is called a false dichotomy. And a dichotomy is an either or. So sometimes groups will narrow down a decision to two choices and they'll think that it's between A and B and that's it. And they don't recognize that there might be like tons of different options in between A and B, but they're stuck on just two options. So like for your service project, you might say, oh, we can either do a blood drive or go work at the homeless shelter, and that's it. And you get stuck arguing these two things when there are lots of other options. Your group has just fallen victim to a false dichotomy where they've narrowed it down to two, and that seems to be the only choice. The middle ground often goes unexplored. Often it will polarize the group because some will be for A and some will be for B. And of course, no alternatives are explored in a false dichotomy. So how do you avoid this? Well, if the group is stuck between two choices and they're arguing about two choices, then someone needs to say, you know what, let's find another option. Let's find option C and introduce that to the group. So someone kind of has to actively introduce an alternative. Anytime your group starts to use terms like always, never, impossible, you're starting to slide into these dichotomies. Those terms are called absolutes, and they'll force you into dichotomy thinking. The last one is a really interesting one. It's called the collective inferential error. And this is where we take inferences about a certain situation, and based on the information that we have or the incomplete information that we have a inference. And there's this great example that I don't have with me right now, but it's a joke about a Nazi on a train. So I'm going to try and tell it without reading it to you, but as best as I can. And they say that, nope, I'm not even going to be able to tell it well. I'll read it at the end of class today, but it's basically this idea that a grandmother and her beautiful granddaughter are traveling on a train in the same train car as a Nazi, a Polish man, and another man, and as they go through a tunnel, they hear somebody kissing and then a slap. And then as they come out of the tunnel, the Nazi has a welt on his face. And the grandmother thinks, my granddaughter is, she can fend for herself. That Nazi tried to kiss her and she smacked him. And the granddaughter thinks, oh, my grandmother is so tough. She, he tried to kiss her or me and she fought back, right? And then the other guy sitting next to the Nazi is like, not a bad plan. I kissed my hand and slapped a Nazi. And it's a terrible joke, but it's this idea that our brain immediately jumps to conclusions and inferences based on the information that it has. And it's not a bad thing, but when groups start to do this, and it's compounded in groups, when groups start to do this, they tend to make big inferential errors, and it's magnified because they're all making the same inference based on faulty or limited information. So they're making big decisions based on only having an incomplete picture of the information. So they make this inferential error. A couple places where these errors can come from. One is called unrepresentativeness. I can never say that word correctly. Unrepresentativeness. And basically where one object is stereotyped by the category it represents. So this is where like stereotypes or racism comes from, where we say, oh, you belong to this race or you are this gender, so you represent all women or all men or all people of this race, right? And that's not true. Everybody is different, but we tend to underrepresent that way. A second one is called the vividness effect, and this is where a really vivid example can make us infer that happens every time. Like like plane crashes. Someone could fear flying on a plane because a plane crash is a really vivid example, when in actuality, the odds of you getting, killed on a plane in a plane crash is really, really low, but it's such a vivid example that it tends to lead to inferences. I remember when I was young, there was one instance in California of a razor blade being found in someone's Halloween candy. And because that was such a vivid example, it made parents paranoid. And so they began to infer that all Halloween candy had the potential to have razor blades. So we weren't allowed to eat our Halloween candy until our parents checked it. And I wonder even if your parents are doing the same thing because of that really vivid example of that idea. So a vivid example can lead to the vividness effect, which makes us think that that's going to happen every time when it doesn't. But it's just that the example was so powerful. Another source of inferential errors is called correlation. And if you're in statistics, right, correlation is not causation. It's a pretty powerful example. It's where you put the information together to come to the wrong conclusion. There was this example in the old textbook of a study that was done in Asia, and they were trying to figure out why Asian teenagers in this certain province had a lower teen pregnancy rate. So they had the families of teenagers who didn't get pregnant basically fill out these surveys, and they asked them all sorts of questions from, what time do your kids go to bed, to how many electronics do you have, to what direction does your house face. Like, they gathered so many random pieces of information, and they started to look for trends or things that multiple families had in common where the kids didn't get pregnant, basically. And they found one commonality, and the commonality was that in every household where there wasn't an instance of teenage pregnancy, the families had a higher number of electronic appliances. So appliances that you plug in for electricity. So an incorrect correlation would be then to come to America and to give every 15-year-old like a toaster and say, here, if your family has this plug-in appliance, your chances for teenage pregnancy go down, right? That's an incorrect inferential error, right? It's making a connection that shouldn't be made with information that you've been given. So it's a collective information error. Correlation is not causation. So how can you fix collective informational errors? Inferential errors, sorry. You can focus the group on the inferential error. So you can be like, I think we're making a wrong inference here. And you can draw their attention to it. And often that's enough just to shift the focus of the group. A single individual can prevent an inferential error. So all it takes is one group member to point it out, and it can be fixed. Okay, so how do groups make good decisions? Ultimately, they need to use one of these three methods in order to make an effective decision. They're called the consensus, the nominal method, and the majority rule. And we're going to do an activity next class period where we try out these methods. So I'll explain them more when we do that. But a consensus just means that the group needs to discuss and debate and compromise and come to a decision that suits everybody. It takes the longest. It's the hardest to do, but it makes most group members satisfied because they were able to talk through their decisions. The second method is called the nominal method, and this is where groups are faced with, let's say they're faced with three choices for their decision, A, B, and C. Well, each group member then ranks what their preference is. So maybe someone ranks A as number 1 and B is number 3 and C is number 2, and then another group member ranks A as number 3 and B is number 1 and C is number 2. So you have everybody rank, and then you add up the numbers. So if there are 4 group members and someone put A as, the first choice, 3 of the group members did, and someone put it at the second, then it would be 2 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. So you would ultimately have a score of 5, and you would do that for each of the choices and the lowest number, the one with the lowest number would be the group's choice. So by default, that means that most people ranked it their first or second choice, and so that's how it's decided. It's a quick way to make decisions, but some people will be unsatisfied because maybe they were the one person that put choice A as like their fourth choice, and everybody else put it as their first, so it was chosen, and so they might be a little unhappy. So you'll have more dissatisfaction than you do with the consensus. And then the final way is majority rule. That way is the easiest, right? You just take a vote and the majority is the rule, or is the decision. And of course, with the majority rule, you have some people who will feel like they didn't get what they wanted. So you have to be prepared to deal with that. But those are kind of the 3 ways to make decisions that can help you avoid some of the most common decision problems. Finally, the last concept we need to talk about is groupthink. And groupthink is actually a historical term. It's shown in or popped up in many historical examples of bad decisions, and lots of groups can fall into groupthink. And ultimately, it's where in a really cohesive group, the members are striving to be unanimous, and that striving to be unanimous and cohesive override their motivation to realistically appraise alternative courses. So they make bad decisions because they're trying to appear unanimous and cohesive. And this happens a lot in government, in corporations, when they're trying to appear as a united front, and then they fall victim to groupthink. And there's actually some big moments in history that are attributed to groupthink. The Bay of Pigs decision, Pearl Harbor, Titanic, Watergate, escalation of the Vietnam War, and one of the most famous is the Columbia Space Shuttle explosion, which we're going to talk about more today, and even some of the decisions in the Iraq War. So they've attributed that to this attempt from the decision makers to appear unanimous, and it led to some faulty decision making. So there has to be a couple conditions for groupthink to occur. One is the group has to be really cohesive. So they have to have worked together for a while and have a really high task and relational, like task and social. And then they have to be seeking agreement. So those 2 conditions, cohesiveness and concurrent seeking. And it doesn't always have to be a factor, but most of the time those 2 do. Critical thinking and effective decision making are sacrificed when they're trying to reach agreement, when that's the ultimate goal. So it's not the cause of every decision, but members of the group will fail to see issues that need to be challenged. There's a lot of confirmation bias happening in groupthink. They'll fail to see positions that need to be questioned. They'll fall into false dichotomies where they're not looking at alternatives that need to be explored. So that tends to happen a lot. We're going to take a minute now and I'm going to have you watch a Challenger or dramatization of what happened with the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. That was probably the best example of groupthink. This video is a little old, but it's a good illustration of what happened leading up to the men and women on board the Challenger dying because the engineers and NASA fell victim to groupthink. When the professor begins writing the conditions on the board, you'll want to make sure to take notes on those. And so I'll review them here after you watch the video, but that's something you'll want to write down.